Welcome to Maple Murders, the podcast that delves into Canada's darkest criminal cases. This is episode 1. He confessed to killing 49 women. Police only charged him with 26. To this day, the true number of his victims is still unknown. On a quiet pig farm in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, a real-life horror story was unfolding, one that would shake Canada to its core. This is the story of Robert Pickton, the man who turned his farm into a graveyard. Just a short drive from the bustling city of Vancouver, the Pickton family farm was a local fixture in the semi-rural landscape of Port Coquitlam. It was acres of muddy fields, weathered buildings, and the noise and smell of pigs. The family had been there for decades, and running the show were two brothers, David and Robert Pickton. To the few people who knew him, Robert, or Willie, was a quiet, socially awkward man. Born in 1949, he dropped out of high school, worked for a bit as a butcher's apprentice, and then spent his life on the family farm. You'd usually see him in his signature rubber boots, his clothes stained from the grime of his work. He mumbled more than he talked, which made him seem simple, maybe even harmless. In the early 1990s, Robert and his brother took over the farm. It was a messy, sprawling property, a maze of barns, trailers, and rusting equipment. While David handled the legitimate business, Robert started a different kind of enterprise. He created a non-profit, a so-called social club he named the Piggy Palace Good Times Society. The name itself was a dark hint of the horrors to come. From his trailer, Pickton threw parties that became legendary in certain circles, but these weren't friendly get-togethers. They were wild, debauched events fueled by booze and drugs, attracting a rough crowd that included local biker gangs and, most importantly, vulnerable women from Vancouver's notorious Downtown Eastside. The Downtown Eastside, or DTES, was a world away from the clean suburbs of Greater Vancouver. It was a neighborhood scarred by poverty, addiction, and despair. For decades, it was a place where people on the edges of society, the poor, the addicted, and a staggering number of Indigenous women, fought to survive. It was a place where you could disappear, and no one in power would seem to notice, and people were disappearing. Starting in the 1990s, the number of women vanishing from the DTES started climbing at a terrifying rate. They were mostly sex workers, women living transient lives, bouncing between shelters and rundown hotels. Their lives were unstable, and authorities often dismissed their disappearances as just another sad part of their high-risk world. Very few people connected the dots. No one saw the pattern, but a predator was at work, and he'd found his perfect hunting ground. The Piggy Palace, with its promise of a party or some quick cash, was the spider's web, and Robert Pickton was the spider. Long before Robert Pickton's name became infamous, the justice system had him right where they wanted him. On March 23, 1997, a woman stumbled off the Pickton farm, bleeding heavily from multiple stab wounds. She told police a terrifying story. She was a sex worker from the Downtown Eastside who Pickton had brought back to his trailer. Once there, he attacked her, cuffing one of her wrists before stabbing her over and over. She fought for her life, managing to grab the weapon, wound him, and get away. Both Pickton and the victim ended up at the same hospital. He was charged with attempted murder, assault with a weapon, and forcible confinement. This was the moment it all should have stopped. He was on the police radar, facing serious charges for a violent attack that perfectly matched what was happening to other women. But the case fell apart. A Crown prosecutor stayed the charges. The official reason? The victim, who was a drug user, was seen as too unstable to be a reliable witness. Concerns about her credibility were enough to let him go. And just like that, Robert Pickton walked free. That decision would become one of the most catastrophic failures in this entire story. It was a screaming alarm, a flashing red light that was just ignored. The families of his future victims, and later, the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry, would point to this moment as the single biggest missed opportunity to stop the slaughter. If the system had just believed this one woman, if her life had been valued enough to fight for justice, dozens of other women might still be alive today. Instead, Pickton was emboldened. He'd learned a valuable lesson. The women he targeted were seen as disposable by the very system meant to protect them. He could act without consequence. The stayed charges weren't just a pass. They were a green light. In the years that followed, the disappearances from the Downtown Eastside didn't just continue. They sped up. Between 1995 and 2001, a dark shadow fell over Vancouver's Downtown Eastside. One by one, women started to vanish. At first, it was just a trickle, easy enough for the authorities to dismiss. A woman named Diana Melnick was last seen in December 1995. Then another in 1996. By 1997, the same year the attempted murder charge against Pickton was stayed, 6 more women disappeared. Then 4 in 1998, 5 in 1999, 2 in 2000, and 7 in 2001. The names became a tragic, growing list. Serena Abbotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Joesbury, Brenda Ann Wolfe, Georgina Papin, Marnie Fry. These were the women Pickton would eventually be convicted of murdering, but they were just a fraction of the total. The full list of women he was charged with killing had 26 names, and that wasn't even the end of it. Ultimately, the DNA of 33 different women would be found on his property. These women weren't just numbers. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. Many were Indigenous, representing a deeply painful chapter in Canada's ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. They were women like Tanya Hollick, whose cousin Lorelei Williams became a powerful voice for justice. They were women like Marnie Fry, whose father, Rick, spent years agonizing over her disappearance, plastering the city with missing posters. Their lives were complicated, often marked by poverty and addiction, but they were lives that mattered. Yet their disappearances were met with a chilling lack of concern. Families who tried to report their loved ones missing were often treated with skepticism by the police. They were told their daughters or sisters were just transient, that they'd probably just moved on. The unspoken message was that their lifestyle made them unworthy of a real investigation. Meanwhile, community activists and outreach workers in the DTES saw the pattern long before the police did. They sounded the alarm, insisting something terrible was happening, that a predator was hunting the most vulnerable among them. They made their own lists of the missing, held vigils, and demanded that someone do something. But for years, nobody listened. And all the while, Robert Pickton kept visiting the Downtown Eastside, a familiar, quiet figure, offering a ride, a drink, or a party at his farm. He preyed on their vulnerability, luring them from the city streets to the isolation of Port Coquitlam. There, shielded by acres of muddy fields and the noise of his pigs, the mumbling farmer became a monster. The women arrived, but they never left. As the list of missing women grew longer, so did the rumors and warnings. But inside the Vancouver Police Department and the RCMP, the response was paralyzed by systemic bias, incompetence, and a stunning lack of urgency. The story of the investigation is really a story of blown chances and ignored warnings. As early as 1998, the Vancouver police had a major lead. A geographic profiler, an expert in mapping serial offender patterns, analyzed the disappearances and concluded it was highly probable that a serial killer was at work. He begged the department to warn the women of the Downtown Eastside. His recommendation was rejected. Senior officers worried it would cause panic. The result was that the very women being hunted were never told a predator was in their midst. Around that same time, tips started coming in that specifically named Robert Pickton. In August 1998, an informant told police a horrifying story. A woman had seen Pickton skinning a woman's body that was hanging from a meat hook on the farm. The information was direct and nightmarish. The Coquitlam RCMP, the police force in charge of Pickton's area, opened an investigation. But it went nowhere fast. There were some interviews, but the investigation just fizzled out. Pickton himself was questioned, but denied everything. And when he offered to let police search his property, they never took him up on it. A turf war between the Vancouver police and the RCMP created a massive gap that the investigation fell right into. Each force seemed to think the other should take the lead. Information wasn't shared, and a culture of competition and blame got in the way of a real joint task force. The VPD did form a missing persons unit, but it was a mess. An internal review later revealed it didn't have the resources, staff, or leadership to handle a crisis of this scale. It wasn't that there weren't good officers on the ground. It was that management failed to see how serious this was and refused to commit. This wasn't just incompetence. It was a reflection of a deep societal prejudice. The victims were seen as less than worthy. Their status as sex workers, drug users, and Indigenous women directly contributed to the pathetic police response. The Missing Women Commission of Inquiry, led by Wally Oppel, later released a damning report that said these women were forsaken, not just by police, but by society itself. The report detailed a pattern of blatant failures and stated that discriminatory attitudes infected the police investigation from the very start. This systemic neglect meant there was no accountability. While police forces failed to work together or follow up on solid leads, Robert Pickton was free to continue his reign of terror for years. He operated in plain sight, protected by the very prejudices that made his victims invisible. The warnings were there, the tips were there, and the killer's name was known. But the will to act simply wasn't. For years, the investigation was stuck. Then, a stroke of luck, or what a police report later called a serendipitous event, finally broke the case wide open. And the tip had nothing to do with murder. In early February 2002, a former truck driver who had worked for the Picktons walked into an RCMP office. He told them he'd recently been inside Robert Pickton's trailer and seen several illegal guns. That was the piece of information police needed, not to investigate murder, but to get a search warrant for an unrelated crime. It was the key that finally unlocked the gates to hell. On February 5th, 2002, a police team raided the farm to execute the firearms warrant. Pickton was arrested on weapons charges and released, but crucially, he was ordered to stay away from the property while police searched. As officers made their way through the filth of his trailer, they started finding things that had nothing to do with guns. They found women's clothing and jewelry. They found purses and ID belonging to some of the missing women. They found an asthma inhaler prescribed to Serena Abbotsway, who had vanished months earlier. The gun search had turned into something else entirely. Police got a second, much bigger warrant, and the farm was sealed off. Project Even-Handed, a joint RCMP-VPD task force, descended on the property. What they found would become the largest, most complex crime scene in Canadian history. The search was a massive undertaking, like an archaeological dig into pure evil. Forensic investigators in hazmat suits spent months sifting through dirt, taking buildings apart piece by piece, and examining the contents of a huge meat grinder. They collected over 200,000 DNA samples and some 600,000 exhibits. The discoveries were beyond horrific. They found the partial remains of women scattered all over the property. DNA belonging to missing women was found all through Pickton's trailer, in a motorhome, and in the soil. They found a .22 caliber revolver with a sex toy attached to the barrel. In his workshop, they found restraints. The sheer amount of evidence was overwhelming, and the gruesome reality was clear. Pickton wasn't just killing these women. He was dismembering them. Prosecutors would later argue he used his skills as a pig farmer and butcher to dispose of their bodies, possibly by feeding them to his pigs or putting them through a meat grinder. On February 22, 2002, with the evidence piling up, Robert Pickton was arrested again. This time, the charges were for 2 counts of first-degree murder. Over the next few months, more charges were laid as the lab processed more evidence, eventually reaching a total of 26 counts of murder. The quiet, mumbling pig farmer was now officially the most prolific serial killer in Canadian history. The farm of horrors had finally given up its secrets. While the world was trying to process the gruesome discoveries at the farm, the police had one more trick up their sleeve. After his arrest for murder, Robert Pickton was put in a jail cell with another man. This was no random cellmate. He was an undercover RCMP officer, posing as a fellow criminal. The goal was to get a confession, and Pickton, thinking he was talking to an equal, finally dropped his guard. The secretly recorded conversation gave a chilling, unfiltered look into the mind of a monster. In the recording, Pickton bragged. He claimed he had killed 49 women. He told the officer he was angry he hadn't killed one more to make it an even 50. Then he gave the closest thing to an explanation he ever would for why he was caught. It wasn't because of brilliant police work. He was caught, in his own words, because he got sloppy. It was a stunningly callous admission. For Pickton, murdering dozens of women was just a job, a project that had gotten messy at the end. There was no remorse, no guilt, just the cold frustration of a workman whose system had failed him. During his formal police interrogation, which was also recorded, Pickton was more evasive, but just as chilling. When shown pictures of the missing women, he showed almost no emotion, just mumbling denials. At other times, a dark arrogance seeped through. When an officer challenged him with a poster of the missing women, he replied, "You're making me more of a mass killer than I am," before laughing. At another point, He acknowledged his situation with a haunting phrase. "The problem is, I'm the head honcho and you got me." The confessions, both to the undercover officer and in his interrogation, painted a picture of a man who saw his victims as nothing more than numbers. He was a predator who thought he was untouchable, brought down only by what he saw as his own mistakes. He never once expressed remorse for the lives he destroyed, only for the sloppiness that led to his arrest. The tapes were a horrifying soundtrack to the evidence being dug up at the farm, confirming both the scale of the horror and the profound emptiness at the heart of the man who did it. The legal case against Robert Pickton was as huge and complicated as the investigation itself. Because of the sheer amount of evidence, the Crown made a controversial choice. They split the 26 murder charges. They would go to trial with the 6 strongest cases first and deal with the other 20 later. The trial for the murders of Serena Abbotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Josbury, Brenda Wolfe, Georgina Puppin, and Marnie Frey finally began in January 2007. The trial was a year-long marathon. The jury saw a mountain of forensic evidence and heard terrifying testimony. The prosecution's case rested on 2 things: the DNA and personal items found on the farm, and Pickton's own chilling confessions. The defense, on the other hand, argued that he wasn't the killer. They tried to paint the farm as a chaotic place where anyone could have committed the murders, and they attacked the credibility of key witnesses. On December 9th, 2007, the jury came back. They found Robert Pickton not guilty of first-degree murder, but guilty on all 6 counts of the lesser charge of second-degree murder. It meant they didn't believe the murders were proven to be planned, but it still held him responsible for the killings. He was sentenced to life in prison, with no chance of parole for 25 years, the maximum sentence possible. The verdict was met with mixed emotions. For the families of the 6 women, it was justice, but for the families of the other 20 women, it was a bitter disappointment. In 2010, the Crown announced it would not proceed with a second trial on the remaining 20 charges, which were officially stayed. Their reasoning was that Pickton was already serving the maximum sentence, and another long, expensive, and traumatic trial wouldn't add a single day to his prison time. For many families, this was devastating, as they felt their loved ones were denied their day in court. Pickton's reign of terror was over, but the story was far from finished. His crimes had ripped open a deep wound in Canadian society, forcing a national conversation about the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The case became a symbol of systemic failure, leading to the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry, which exposed the blatant failures of the police and the societal indifference that let a monster hunt for years. Robert Pickton spent the rest of his days in a maximum security prison. On May 19th, 2024, he was assaulted by another inmate at the Port Coquitlam institution in Quebec. A report on the incident stated that the attacker grabbed a broom, broke the handle, and thrust it into Pickton's face. He was airlifted to a hospital and placed on life support, but died from his injuries 12 days later, on May 31st, 2024, at the age of 74. His death was a final, violent end to a brutal life. But for the families of his victims and for the nation he horrified, the story doesn't end there. The memory of the women he murdered and the legacy of his crimes lives on. The Robert Pickton case is more than a true crime story. It's a Canadian horror story that shows what happens when a society fails its most vulnerable people. It's the story of a man who was able to kill again and again, not because he was some kind of evil genius, but because his victims were considered invisible. They were women from the margins of society, whose lives were seen as less important, whose disappearances were ignored, and whose families' pleas for help were dismissed. The blatant failures of the police weren't just simple mistakes. They were the product of deep-seated biases that still exist today. The turf wars between police forces, the ignored tips, the stayed charges, all of it created a space where a predator could operate for years without fear. The legacy of this case is twofold. There's the legacy of pain, the unending grief of the families who lost their mothers, daughters, and sisters. Their fight for answers and accountability continues, a powerful testament to their love and strength. And then there's the legacy of change, as slow and incomplete as it might be. The Pickton case forced Canada to face the national crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, leading to a national inquiry and a difficult, ongoing conversation about justice and systemic racism. Robert Pickton is gone, his life ending in the same kind of violence he lived by. But the questions his case forced us to ask are still here. How do we protect the vulnerable? How do we make sure every life is seen as worthy of protection? And how do we hold our own institutions accountable when they fail so completely? The pig farm in Port Coquitlam is gone, but its shadow remains. It's a grim reminder that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones we, as a society, choose not to see. Thank you for joining us on Maple Murders, where we bring you true crime from the true north. The stories of these women deserve to be remembered, and the lessons from these failures can't be forgotten. If you found this episode informative, please like and subscribe. More importantly, we want to hear from you. What part of this story stands out to you the most? What do you think is the most important lesson to be learned from the Pickton case? Let us know by leaving a comment or a review. Your engagement helps keep these important conversations going.